July 27, 1944. The skies above Bavaria. Hauptmann Franz Weidenbacher, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe pilot with over 200 combat missions under his belt, felt his hands tighten on the control column of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 as an impossible sound tore through the air. What he heard defied every principle of aerial combat he'd mastered over 4 years of war. Instead of the familiar roar of piston engines and propeller wash, a high-pitched screaming howl, unlike anything in nature, ripped past him at a speed that seemed to violate the laws of physics itself. The air pressure change buffeted his aircraft so violently that for a moment he thought he'd been hit by flak. Through his canopy, Weidenbacher caught only a silver blur, a shape that resembled an aircraft but moved with the velocity of an artillery shell. In that fraction of a second, everything he understood about air superiority, tactical advantage, and the technological supremacy he'd been assured Germany possessed shattered like glass. This moment would mark not just a turning point in the war, but the obsolescence of an entire generation of aerial warfare doctrine. Before we explore how this revelation changed everything for these experienced combat pilots who suddenly found themselves outmatched by an enemy they couldn't even catch, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world who are fascinated by these untold stories of human discovery during the Second World War. The story begins 3 years earlier, when Franz Weidenbacher was a young flight instructor at the Luftwaffe training facility in Schwerin, filled with absolute confidence in German technological superiority. He had been raised on the mythology of German engineering excellence, the Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters that had dominated European skies in the early war years, the precision manufacturing that made Germany's aircraft the envy of the world. When he received his combat posting in 1941, Franz carried with him not just his training manuals and personal effects, but an unshakable belief that no Allied power could match the Reich's industrial innovation. His instructors had drilled into him and his fellow pilots a simple doctrine. German aircraft were faster, more maneuverable, and more lethal than anything the British or Americans could produce. The Spitfire was respectable, they admitted, but ultimately inferior. American aircraft were dismissed as mass-produced mediocrity, quantity over quality, built by a nation of shopkeepers and farmers who understood commerce but not the warrior's craft. Franz's early combat experience seemed to confirm everything he'd been taught. During his first year of operations over the English Channel and later over the Eastern Front, he had achieved 11 confirmed kills, watching enemy aircraft tumble from the sky, trailing smoke and flame. He knew the silhouette of every Allied fighter, could identify them by engine sound alone, understood their performance envelopes and tactical weaknesses. The Spitfire turned well but couldn't match the Bf 109's climbing rate. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was heavily armored but sluggish in comparison to German fighters. The Soviet Yak-9 was nimble but fragile. Franz had internalized these characteristics the way a chess master memorizes opening gambits, and this knowledge had kept him alive through countless engagements. By 1944, he was considered a veteran, one of the increasingly rare experienced pilots in a Luftwaffe that was bleeding skilled aviators at an unsustainable rate. But something began to change in the spring of that year. Intelligence briefings mentioned something new, whispered rumors of experimental British aircraft without propellers, powered by some kind of turbine engine that supposedly gave them extraordinary speed. Most pilots dismissed these reports as Allied propaganda or exaggeration. Franz himself had laughed when a younger pilot asked if the rumors could be true, responding with the practiced confidence of experience that the British were desperate, inventing mythical superweapons to cover for their industrial inadequacies. Every nation had experimental prototypes, after all. Germany had its own jet program, the Messerschmitt 262, which Franz had heard about through unofficial channels. That the British might have developed something similar seemed unlikely. That they might have actually deployed it to combat squadrons seemed impossible. The engineering challenges alone would take years to overcome, and surely German intelligence would have detected such a program long before it reached operational status. The first confirmed encounter report came in June 1944, filed by a reconnaissance pilot who claimed he'd been overtaken by an aircraft traveling at least 150 kilometers per hour faster than his maximum speed. The pilot described a twin-engine design with no visible propellers, painted in standard RAF camouflage colors, that had appeared from nowhere, circled his aircraft twice as if conducting an inspection, then vanished ahead with stunning acceleration. The report was met with skepticism at the squadron briefing. Measurement errors were common in the stress of combat. Altitude and angle tricks could make aircraft appear faster than they actually were. The reconnaissance pilot was experienced and trusted, but a single sighting proved nothing definitive. Franz remembered thinking the poor man had probably encountered a Messerschmitt 262 on a test flight and mistaken it for an enemy aircraft, an embarrassing but understandable error given the jet's unconventional appearance. Then came the incident that would transform everything Franz believed about the technological balance of the war. On that July morning, he had led a flight of 4 Bf-109s on a bomber interception mission, scrambled to defend against a reported formation of American B-17 heavy bombers approaching Munich. The weather was clear, visibility excellent, perfect conditions for aerial combat. As his flight climbed to intercept altitude, Franz ran through the familiar mental checklist that had become second nature. Check fuel, ammunition count, scan for enemy escorts, position for attack run. His squadron had developed effective tactics against the American heavy bombers, coordinated attacks from multiple angles to overwhelm the defensive gunners, quick slashing attacks and immediate disengagement to avoid the massed firepower of the bomber formations. He'd executed this type of mission dozens of times. What happened next surprised everyone in his flight. As they approached the bomber formation at 24,000 feet, Franz noticed a glint of metal at a much higher altitude, perhaps 32,000 feet, moving at a speed that immediately struck him as wrong. At first, he thought it might be a reconnaissance aircraft, but the closure rate was far too fast. Then the shape became clearer, and his mind struggled to process what his eyes were reporting. The aircraft had swept wings, a design feature he associated with high-speed flight, but it lacked any visible propellers. 2 engine nacelles hung beneath the wings, but instead of the usual radial or inline engine configuration, they appeared smooth and streamlined, almost like elongated teardrops. As the aircraft dove toward his formation, that impossible screaming sound reached him even through his closed cockpit, a noise that seemed to combine the shriek of a diving Stuka with the roar of a rocket, but sustained continuously. Franz instinctively broke right and dove, a defensive maneuver that had saved his life many times before. But this time it felt futile. The enemy aircraft, later identified as a British Gloucester Meteor, flashed past his formation at a speed Franz estimated at over 750 kilometers per hour, at least 200 kilometers per hour faster than his Bf-109's maximum velocity. In the 3 seconds the jet remained visible, Franz observed details his brain could barely process. The smooth, streamlined fuselage, the absence of any propeller disc, the blue-white glow visible from the engine exhausts, the casual ease with which it maneuvered at speeds that should have torn its wings off. Then it was gone, climbing away at an angle and rate that no piston-engine fighter could match, accelerating into the distance as if his Messerschmitt were standing still. The radio crackled with confusion from his wingmen. What was that? Did anyone get a shot? How fast was that thing going? Franz found his voice, though it sounded strange even to himself, stripped of its usual certainty. Unknown aircraft type, extreme speed, unable to engage. The words felt inadequate, a technical description that captured none of the visceral shock of the encounter. He continued with the bomber interception mission because that was his duty and his training. But his mind kept returning to those 3 seconds, analyzing and reanalyzing what he'd witnessed, trying to reconcile it with everything he thought he knew. After landing, Franz filed his encounter report with meticulous detail, noting the aircraft's configuration, estimated speed, altitude, and heading. The intelligence officer who received his report nodded slowly, consulting a growing file of similar sightings. "You're the fourth pilot this week to report something matching that description," the officer said quietly, pulling out reconnaissance photographs that showed several of the mysterious aircraft on the ground at an RAF base in Belgium. "We've confirmed the British have deployed at least 2 squadrons of these jets. The Americans have their own version in development as well. Our intelligence completely missed how far along their programs had advanced." Franz felt something shift inside him, a crack in the foundation of certainties that had sustained him through years of combat. If German intelligence had failed to detect this level of Allied technological development, what else had they missed? What other assumptions were built on foundations of wishful thinking and propaganda rather than reality? The briefing room discussions over the following weeks painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The British Gloucester Meteor had entered limited service in July 1944. Initially deployed to intercept V-1 flying bombs, but soon expanded to fighter operations over the continent. While the Meteor had some performance limitations at high altitude, its low-level speed was breathtaking, topping 770 kilometers per hour in level flight. More concerning was the news that this was merely the British stepping stone to more advanced designs. Reports indicated they were developing improved engines and airframe designs that would push performance even higher. Meanwhile, the Americans were completing tests of their own jet fighter, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, with projected speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour and far better high-altitude performance than the early British designs. Franz learned that Germany's own jet program, while technically sophisticated, was hamstrung by resource shortages, production bottlenecks, and Hitler's insistence on converting the Me-262 from a fighter into a bomber, a decision that delayed its deployment and compromised its effectiveness. The few Me-262s that had reached operational squadrons were showing impressive performance, but chronic engine reliability problems meant many missions ended with emergency landings or catastrophic failures. The Jumo 004 turbojet engines that powered the 262 had a mean time between failures of just 25 hours, compared to 200 to 300 hours for conventional piston engines. Pilots were trained to treat their engines like glass sculptures, avoiding rapid throttle changes and keeping careful watch on turbine temperatures that could spike at dangerous ranges with little warning. But what really disturbed Franz wasn't the technical specifications, impressive as they were. It was the realization that the Allies had not only matched German jet technology, but were producing and deploying it with an industrial efficiency that Germany simply couldn't replicate. Intelligence estimates suggested the British were manufacturing Meteors at a rate of over 200 aircraft per month, with production accelerating. By contrast, German M262 production struggled to reach 50 aircraft per month, and many of those never reached operational squadrons due to fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, or Allied bombing of transportation networks. The disparity wasn't just about which nation had invented jet engines first, it was about which industrial system could transform experimental technology into operational capability. Franz found himself thinking about his pre-war training, the lectures about German engineering superiority and Allied industrial inadequacy. Those lectures had contained a dangerous assumption that quality would always triumph over quantity, that German precision and innovation would overcome any material disadvantage. But jet engines exposed the fallacy of that reasoning. The British and Americans hadn't needed to invent superior technology, they'd simply needed to manufacture adequate technology in overwhelming numbers. A Gloucester Meteor wasn't necessarily better engineered than an M262. But if Britain could field 5 Meteors for every German jet, engineering excellence became irrelevant. The war was being decided not in research laboratories, but in factory production lines, and on that battlefield, Germany was comprehensively outmatched. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was profound and widespread. Franz observed it first in the younger pilots, those who had joined the service in 1943 and 1944 with the same confidence he'd once felt. After encountering Allied jets, their behavior changed noticeably. They became more cautious, more reluctant to engage, quicker to break off combat. The bravado that had characterized fighter pilots in the early war years was draining away, replaced by a grim pragmatism focused on survival rather than victory. More experienced pilots like Franz tried to maintain morale, but it was difficult to inspire confidence when the evidence of Allied technological and industrial supremacy was so overwhelming. Every mission briefing brought new intelligence about Allied capabilities, each report more concerning than the last. In September 1944, Franz was temporarily assigned to a special evaluation unit that was testing captured Allied equipment, including components from a crashed Gloucester meteor that had been recovered nearly intact after a forced landing in occupied territory. The opportunity to examine the British jet up close was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Franz had expected to find crude workmanship, the kind of rushed production that characterized mass-manufactured equipment. Instead, he discovered precision engineering that matched or exceeded German standards in many areas. The Rolls-Royce Welland engines showed sophisticated metallurgy and careful quality control. The airframe was robustly constructed, with thoughtful design details that spoke to extensive testing and refinement. The cockpit instrumentation was comprehensive and logically arranged. The overall impression was of a mature weapons system, not an experimental prototype. What shocked him most was a small detail that seemed insignificant at first, but carried enormous implications. Stamped into various components throughout the aircraft were production dates and serial numbers, indicating the Meteor had been manufactured in June 1944, just weeks before Franz encountered one in combat. The British weren't just producing a few experimental jets for testing, they were running full-scale production lines that could output complete aircraft in the time it took Germany to assemble engines. One of the technical officers examining the wreckage explained the significance. "Look at these manufacturing marks. This engine casing was cast as a single piece, not welded from multiple sections. That requires sophisticated foundry techniques and expensive tooling, but it dramatically reduces production time and improves reliability." The British invested in the manufacturing infrastructure first, then scaled up production. We tried to do it backwards, perfecting the design before solving the production challenges. Now they're 6 months ahead of us and accelerating. Franz participated in test flights of Germany's Me-262, experiencing firsthand both the exhilaration and the frustration of jet-powered flight. The acceleration was intoxicating, like being launched from a catapult, pinning him back in his seat with a force no piston engine could match. Within seconds of throttle application, the aircraft surged forward with breathtaking urgency, the ground falling away at angles that seemed impossible. In level flight at altitude, the world took on a dreamlike quality. The Me-262 covering distances in heartbeats that would have taken minutes in his Bf-109. For brief moments, Franz understood why some pilots spoke of jet flight with an almost religious fervor, describing it as the closest thing to pure speed that a human could experience while remaining in control. But the engine limitations were equally stark. The Jumo 004 turbojets required constant monitoring, their turbine temperatures hovering dangerously close to failure thresholds. Rapid throttle movements could cause compressor stalls that flamed out the engines, leaving the pilot gliding a very expensive and poorly designed glider. Fuel consumption was voracious, the Me-262 burning through its tanks at nearly triple the rate of conventional fighters, limiting endurance to under an hour of flight time. Worse, the engines were temperamental at low speeds, requiring delicate handling during takeoff and landing, precisely when pilots were most vulnerable to attack. Allied fighters had learned to patrol German airfields, waiting for Me-262s at their most helpless moments during approach and departure. Many German jets were lost not in air combat, but during these vulnerable phases, shot down before they could leverage their speed advantage. The real shock came when Franz spoke with Me-262 pilots who had engaged Allied jets in combat. Their accounts revealed a frustrating reality. Speed alone didn't guarantee victory. One pilot, Oberleutnant Klaus Reinhardt, described an encounter with American P-80 shooting stars over the Rhine in late 1944. "I had the altitude advantage and initiated a diving attack," Reinhardt explained, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone recounting a traumatic experience. "The American jets simply accelerated away from me. Not by much, perhaps 50 kilometers per hour, but enough. In a piston fighter, I could have closed that gap. In the 262, I was already at maximum speed and had nowhere to go. We circled each other for perhaps 2 minutes, neither able to gain a decisive advantage, both burning fuel at alarming rates. Then my starboard engine started overheating and I had to disengage before it failed completely. The American followed me for a while, probably ensuring I wasn't trying to lure him into a trap, then broke off and returned to his patrol area. The entire engagement was tactically inconclusive but strategically devastating. It proved that our jet technology wasn't a war-winning advantage, it was parity at best, and given Allied production capabilities, parity meant eventual defeat. By early 1945, the jet engine revelation had fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the air war. Franz observed this transformation not just in combat operations, but in the quiet moments between missions, in the way pilots discuss the future. The conversations had changed from when we win to if we survive. Men who had once spoken confidently about pushing the Allies back now talked in hushed tones about what they would do after the war, as if defeat were inevitable, and the only question was whether they'd live to see it. The jets that were supposed to restore German air superiority had instead become a daily reminder of Allied industrial dominance, symbols not of technological salvation, but of how thoroughly Germany had been outproduced and outmaneuvered. Franz was transferred to Jagdwand 44, an elite unit flying Me-262s under the command of legendary ace Adolf Galland, who had assembled the last generation of Germany's most experienced fighter pilots for a final defense of the Reich. The unit represented the best of what remained. Pilots with hundreds of missions, decades of combined combat experience, and aircraft that were theoretically superior to anything the Allies could field. Yet even here, in this concentration of skill and technology, the mood was somber. Galland himself acknowledged the reality in a briefing that Franz would remember for the rest of his life. "Gentlemen, we fly the world's first operational jet fighter. It is faster than any Allied aircraft. It is more heavily armed. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it is nearly untouchable. But we are 40 jets defending a front that stretches 1,000 kilometers. The Allies put 1,000 aircraft into the sky every day. Do the mathematics. We are not fighting a war. We are performing a funeral rite for a dying nation. Fly well, kill efficiently, and try to survive until sanity returns to Germany's leadership." The combat operations from Jagdwand 44 provided Franz with a clear view of both the potential and the futility of jet technology in the closing months of the war. On his first mission, flying the Me-262, Franz intercepted a formation of American B-17 bombers escorted by P-51 Mustang fighters. The speed differential was immediately apparent. As Franz dove on the bombers, the Mustang escorts tried to intercept him but were simply too slow to prevent his attack. He lined up on a B-17, close to 600 meters, and fired his 4 30mm cannons, watching the heavy shells tear through the bomber's wing root. The B-17 began trailing smoke and dropped out of formation, crew members bailing out as the aircraft fell toward Earth. Franz pulled up sharply, accelerated away from the formation, and was climbing back to altitude before the Mustang fighters could react. In a piston engine fighter, he would have been vulnerable to counterattack for 30 to 45 seconds. In the Me-262, he was untouchable after just 10 seconds. But the tactical success couldn't mask the strategic reality. Franz learned that Jagdverband 44 was flying perhaps 20 missions per day across all aircraft, weather permitting. American and British air forces were flying thousands of sorties daily. The mathematics Gallant had mentioned were inescapable. Even if every Me-262 mission resulted in multiple kills, it wouldn't significantly impact the massive Allied aerial campaign. The bombers kept coming, day after day, systematically destroying what remained of Germany's industrial capacity. Fuel refineries, ball bearing plants, synthetic rubber factories, transportation networks, all were being methodically obliterated. The jets themselves were increasingly difficult to fuel, their kerosene-based Jet A1 fuel competing for refinery capacity with aviation gasoline, diesel, and vehicle petrol. By March 1945, missions were sometimes canceled not due to aircraft availability or pilot readiness, but simply because there wasn't enough fuel to fill the tanks. Franz flew his most psychologically impactful mission on March 18, 1945, during an engagement that would crystallize everything he'd learned about the changing nature of aerial warfare. Leading a formation of 3 Me-262s, he intercepted a mixed group of American bombers and British Meteors providing high cover. The resulting engagement was unlike anything Franz had experienced in his years of combat flying. Both sides possessed comparable speed, neither jet type having a decisive advantage. The combat devolved into a strange dance of energy management. Both German and Allied pilots trying to leverage altitude for diving attacks, while conserving fuel and avoiding the dangerous low-speed regime where jet fighters became sluggish and vulnerable. Franz managed to damage one of the Meteors, his cannon shells striking the British jet's starboard engine and forcing it to disengage, trailing smoke. But he couldn't pursue because 2 other Meteors were positioning for an attack on his wingman. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 4 minutes, during which both sides maneuvered aggressively, but neither achieved decisive results. As Franz disengaged and headed back toward base, he realized he'd just participated in a preview of future aerial combat. In 15 years of aviation history, fighter combat had evolved from wood and fabric biplanes flying at 150 kilometers per hour to all-metal jets exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. The fundamental nature of air combat had changed completely, and Germany's temporary technological edge had already been matched and was being surpassed. After landing, Franz sat in his cockpit for several minutes before shutting down his engines, watching the turbine temperatures slowly decay on his gauges. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the cognitive dissonance of the last hour. He had just fought Allied jets to a tactical draw, proving that German engineering could match British technology in a direct engagement. But the victory felt hollow because he understood the broader context. The British pilot he damaged would probably make it back to base. The aircraft would be repaired using parts from British factories that were producing engines and components by the thousands. Meanwhile, Franz's Me-262 would be cannibalized for parts because replacement engines weren't available. The British pilot would fly again tomorrow. Franz might be grounded for a week waiting for maintenance that might never come. In the debriefing room, the intelligence officer showed Franz reconnaissance photographs that had been taken that morning. The images showed Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands where row after row of aircraft were parked in neat lines. Meteors, P-80 Shooting Stars, conventional P-51s, and Spitfires all maintained and fueled and ready for operations. The officer pulled out a comparison photograph of German airfields, where aircraft were dispersed and hidden to avoid Allied bombing, many lacking fuel or spare parts, some cannibalized to keep a handful of aircraft operational. "Count the aircraft in these images," the officer said quietly. "The British have more operational Meteors in this single base than we have Me-262s in the entire theater. And they're producing more every day while our production facilities are being bombed around the clock. This is what defeat looks like when you see it from altitude." Franz began to understand that the jet engine revelation wasn't primarily about technology at all. It was about industrial systems, manufacturing capacity, resource allocation, and the fundamental economic structure that supported military operations. Germany had invented the jet engine, developed the first operational jet fighter, and deployed it to combat before any Allied nation. But those achievements were meaningless without the industrial base to sustain them, the resource network to fuel them, and the manufacturing capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. The Allies hadn't needed to invent jet engines first. They'd simply needed to engineer manufacturable designs and then apply their massive industrial capacity to production. Quality without quantity was a losing strategy, and Germany had bet everything on the former while ignoring the latter. The final weeks of the war brought a surreal quality to flight operations. Franz continued flying missions even as the front lines collapsed and communication networks broke down. Many missions launched without clear objectives simply because fuel was available and aircraft were operational, and doing nothing felt more dangerous than flying into uncertain tactical situations. Franz witnessed the final death throes of the Luftwaffe. Aircraft destroyed on the ground during Allied strafing runs because there was no fuel to disperse them. Pilots killed in training accidents because there were no experienced instructors left alive to properly train replacements. Missions abandoned because the designated landing field had been captured hours earlier and no one had informed the pilots before takeoff. On April 24, 1945, Franz flew his last combat mission in an Me-262, part of a hastily organized strike against Soviet forces approaching Berlin. The mission was militarily pointless. Everyone involved understood that. But orders were orders, and some fragment of military discipline still functioned even as the Reich crumbled. Franz and two wingmen strafed a column of Soviet tanks, their 30mm cannons doing little real damage against heavy armor, but creating chaos and confusion. As he pulled up from the attack run, Franz saw something that would stay with him forever. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft crowding the sky, Il-2 Sturmovix and Yak fighters forming a dense aerial armada that blotted out sections of the horizon. The disparity was so overwhelming it was almost abstract, like comparing a bucket of water to an ocean. Franz returned to base to find evacuation orders had been issued during his mission. The airfield was being abandoned, ground crews were destroying equipment that couldn't be transported, and pilots were being directed to fly their aircraft to southern Germany or Austria or simply abandon them if fuel wasn't available. Franz walked through the operations building one last time, passing walls covered with maps showing front lines that no longer matched reality, tactical boards listing squadron strengths that were fiction, and organizational charts depicting a command structure that had essentially ceased to function. In the records room, file cabinets stood open, their contents either burned or scattered across the floor. Franz picked up a document at random, a technical report from 1943 evaluating jet engine development programs. The report concluded that Germany was at least 2 years ahead of Allied jet research, and that this technological advantage would be decisive in maintaining air superiority. Franz dropped the report and walked outside to where his Me-262 sat in a camouflaged revetment. The jet looked almost new, its metal skin still gleaming despite months of combat operations. The aircraft represented the pinnacle of German aeronautical engineering, a technological marvel that could outrun any Allied fighter and was armed with enough firepower to destroy bombers with a single pass. It was also utterly irrelevant to the outcome of the war. Franz had flown perhaps 30 combat missions in jets, achieved 8 kills, and survived encounters with Allied aircraft that would have been impossible in conventional fighters. None of it had mattered. The Me-262 program had come too late, in too small numbers, supported by an industrial system that was already collapsing under the weight of Allied strategic bombing. As Franz prepared to destroy his aircraft per evacuation protocols, removing the weapons and sabotaging the engines so they couldn't be used by advancing Allied forces, he thought about the British pilot he'd encountered in July 1944, that first shocking glimpse of a Gloucester meteor that had shattered his assumptions about technological superiority. 9 months had passed since that moment. Germany had gone from believing it possessed a war-winning technological advantage to understanding that Allied industrial capacity had rendered that advantage meaningless. The psychological journey from confidence to despair had been brutal and complete, made more painful by the gradual nature of the revelation. There had been no single moment of defeat, just an accumulating weight of evidence that Germany's technological sophistication couldn't overcome Allied material abundance. Franz surrendered to American forces on May 2, 1945, along with thousands of other German military personnel who chose Western captivity over Soviet occupation. The American intelligence officers who debriefed him were particularly interested in his experience flying jets, questioning him extensively about performance characteristics, tactical employment, and operational challenges. Franz answered their questions honestly, partly because resistance seemed pointless, and partly because he was curious about what the Americans knew and didn't know about jet technology. The intelligence officer conducting the interview was a young lieutenant named Morrison, who had been an aeronautical engineering student before the war. Morrison treated Franz with professional courtesy, but also with an almost clinical interest, like a scientist studying an interesting specimen. "We recovered several Me-262s in flyable condition," Morrison explained during one session. "Our test pilots are very impressed with the performance. Top speed, rate of climb, firepower, all exceptional. But they also noted the engine limitations, the short service life, the temperamental throttle response. It's sophisticated technology that wasn't quite ready for full-scale operational use." Franz felt a flash of defensive pride, wanting to argue that German engineering had solved problems the Allies were still struggling with, but the words died before he could speak them. What was the point? The Americans already had their own jets, the P-80 was entering production, and they'd learned from German mistakes rather than repeating them. In a year or two, American jets would be flying with the same performance as the Me-262, but with better reliability, longer service life, and manufactured in numbers that Germany could never have matched. Morrison pulled out a thick file folder containing technical documents, reconnaissance photographs, and intelligence reports. "I want to show you something that might interest you," he said, spreading papers across the table. "This is what we knew about German jet development at various points during the war." He pointed to a report dated November 1943. "At this point, our intelligence indicated you were conducting jet engine tests, but we had no concrete evidence of a fighter program. We assumed it was still experimental, probably years away from deployment." He moved to a report from March 1944. "By here, we had photographs of what looked like jet aircraft at test facilities, but we still thought it was a research program. Our estimate was that operational deployment wouldn't happen before 1946 at the earliest." Then Morrison pulled out a report from July 1944, shortly after Franz's first encounter with a British Meteor. "This is when everything changed. Your jets started appearing in combat, and suddenly our intelligence picture was completely wrong. You weren't years behind schedule, you were actually ahead of us in some ways. That caused what you might call a panic at the Pentagon. If Germany could deploy operational jets in 1944, what else had our intelligence missed? Were you developing atomic weapons, long-range missiles, other secret technologies we hadn't detected?" Morrison smiled thinly. "So, we accelerated everything. The P-80 program went from experimental priority to maximum urgency. Production facilities that were building P-51s were retooled for jets. We threw money and resources at the problem like there was no tomorrow. And you know what we discovered? That jet engines weren't actually that hard to manufacture once you accepted some compromises in performance and reliability. The British had already figured this out. They'd developed adequate engines using available materials and then scaled up production. We did the same thing." Franz listened to this with a mixture of fascination and bitterness. So, Germany's technological advantage actually accelerated Allied jet development, he said slowly, understanding the irony. If we hadn't deployed the Me-262, you might have taken another year or two to field your own jets. We basically showed you the path and motivated you to follow it faster." Morrison nodded. "Pretty much, yes. War has this effect of accelerating technology transfer. You develop something, we capture examples or defectors or intelligence reports, then we adapt and improve on your work. Sometimes it happens in reverse. The Norden bomb sight, radar systems, proximity fuses, all of these technologies spread between both sides faster than they would have in peacetime. Jet engines were just another example of that process." The conversation shifted to strategic implications, and here Morrison's tone became more analytical, less personal. "What we learned from the jet race wasn't primarily about technology," he explained. "It was about industrial systems and how they interact with military innovation. Germany had brilliant engineers and sophisticated manufacturing, but your industrial base was relatively small and it was under constant attack. Britain had good engineers and a robust industrial base that was mostly safe from bombing. America had adequate engineers and the largest industrial capacity in human history, completely untouched by enemy action. So, when jets moved from experimental to operational, the outcome was predetermined. You could invent the technology first, but we could manufacture it in greater numbers, faster, with better logistics support." France spent 3 months in American custody before being repatriated to Germany in August 1945. During that time, he had extensive opportunity to observe American operations, military logistics, and industrial capacity. The scale was staggering in ways that still shocked him, despite everything he'd learned during the final year of the war. The American airfield where he was held temporarily housed over 200 aircraft, all maintained to what seemed like peacetime standards, with spare parts abundant and fuel unlimited. France watched mechanics tear down a P-51's engine for routine maintenance, discarding components that a German ground crew would have carefully rebuilt and reused. When he asked about this, an American sergeant explained cheerfully that it was faster and cheaper to install new parts than rebuild old ones, and the factory supply chain ensured replacement components arrived faster than mechanics could install them. The cultural difference was profound and symbolically important. German military culture emphasized thrift, efficiency, and maximizing the use of limited resources. American military culture emphasized abundance, rapid replacement, and treating equipment as disposable if that improved operational tempo. Neither approach was inherently superior in an abstract sense, but in the context of total war, abundance overwhelmed efficiency. Germany could maintain a smaller number of aircraft at higher operational readiness rates through careful maintenance and resource management. America could maintain a larger number of aircraft at adequate readiness rates through brute force logistics. When the forces met in combat, the side with more aircraft won, regardless of marginal differences in individual aircraft readiness. France was finally released in late summer of 1945 and returned to a Germany that was barely recognizable. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, the population was traumatized and starving, and the nation had been divided into occupation zones controlled by foreign powers. He made his way back to his hometown of Rostock on the Baltic coast, traveling through a landscape that looked like something from an apocalyptic vision. Factories were burned out shells, bridges were collapsed, roads were cratered by bombs and artillery. At night, there was no electricity, and the darkness was absolute, except for occasional fires still burning in ruined buildings. France had flown over this destruction many times during the final months of the war, but seeing it from ground level made it personal in a way that aerial observation never could. Each ruined building represented families displaced. Each destroyed factory meant jobs lost and industrial capacity eliminated. The scale of the devastation was comprehensive and systematic, the result of years of strategic bombing that had methodically dismantled Germany's ability to wage war. In Rostock, France found his family home damaged but still standing, a minor miracle in a city where entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. His mother and younger sister had survived in the basement during the worst of the bombing, living for weeks in a single room while the battle for the city raged overhead and in the streets. They were malnourished, exhausted, and traumatized, but alive. Franz's father had been killed in 1943 during an air raid on Hamburg, where he'd been working at a shipyard. His older brother had died on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1944. Of the five-member Weidenbacher family that had celebrated Christmas together in 1939, only 3 remained. The family's story was unremarkable in the context of post-war Germany, where every family had lost someone, and survival itself was considered fortunate. Franz found work eventually, though opportunities were scarce for former military officers in occupied Germany. He took whatever jobs were available, clearing rubble, repairing damaged buildings, loading and unloading supplies for the occupation forces. The work was physically demanding and poorly paid, but it was employment, and it kept him occupied during days that otherwise would have been consumed by dark thoughts. At night, when sleep wouldn't come, Franz would lie awake thinking about his war experiences, trying to process what he'd witnessed and understand what it meant for the future. The jet engine encounters had been transformative, not just tactically, but philosophically, forcing him to confront how thoroughly his understanding of technological progress and national capacity had been shaped by propaganda and wishful thinking. Years later, in 1952, Franz was working as a flight instructor at a small civilian aviation school that had been established to train the next generation of commercial pilots. Germany was beginning to recover economically, the occupation zones were transitioning toward eventual reunification of the Western territories, and aviation was once again becoming a respectable profession rather than a reminder of military defeat. One afternoon, Franz was approached by a student pilot named Thomas Schreiber, a young man barely 20 years old who'd been born during the war and had no personal memory of the conflict. Thomas had heard rumors that his instructor had flown jets during the war and was curious about the experience. Franz was reluctant to discuss his combat history, a reticence common among German veterans who preferred to move forward rather than dwell on painful memories. But Thomas was persistent, and eventually Franz agreed to share some of his experiences. They sat in the flight school's small office after the day's training sessions were complete, and Franz found himself describing that July 1944 encounter with the British meteor, the moment when his understanding of technological superiority had shattered. Thomas listened with rapt attention, asking technical questions about performance characteristics and tactical implications. As Franz talked, he realized he was describing not just a military encounter, but a broader lesson about assumptions, propaganda, and the danger of believing your own mythology. The real lesson wasn't about jet engines specifically, Franz explained, choosing his words carefully. It was about the importance of understanding reality as it actually exists, rather than as you wish it to be. We were told Germany had the best technology, the best engineers, the most advanced military systems. Some of that was true. Our engineers were excellent, and our technology was often sophisticated. But we missed the bigger picture. Technology means nothing without the industrial capacity to produce it, the resources to fuel it, and the logistics to sustain it. The Allies understood this. They didn't need to have the best technology, they just needed good enough technology manufactured in overwhelming quantities. That's how they won the air war, and ultimately how they won the larger conflict. Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing this. So you're saying that innovation alone doesn't guarantee victory? Franz nodded. Innovation is important, but it's only one factor among many. Industrial capacity, resource access, logistics networks, trained personnel, all of these matter just as much as having the best equipment. Germany had innovative technology, but inadequate production. That combination is worse than having adequate technology with massive production. The British Meteor wasn't necessarily better than the Me-262 in a direct comparison, but Britain could build 10 Meteors in the time it took us to build one 262, and they had the fuel to fly all 10 while we struggled to fuel our single aircraft. That disparity is what defeats you, not the technical specifications. The conversation continued for over an hour, ranging across topics of technology, warfare, national mythology, and the dangers of propaganda. Franz found it oddly therapeutic to articulate lessons he'd internalized but never fully verbalized. The experience of fighting against Allied jets had taught him humility about technological achievement, showing him that invention was only the first step in a much longer process of development, production, and deployment. Germany had invented the jet engine and deployed it to combat first. But that initial advantage had been overwhelmed by Allied industrial systems that could take adequate technology and scale it to decisive levels. The lesson was applicable far beyond military aviation, relevant to any field where innovation intersects with production and deployment. As Thomas prepared to leave, he asked one final question. Do you think jet engines changed warfare fundamentally, or were they just an incremental improvement? Franz considered this carefully before answering. They changed everything, but not in the way people expected. The jet engine didn't create a superweapon that could reverse the course of the war. Instead, it demonstrated that technological innovation was accelerating in ways that made doctrinal stability impossible. In World War I, aircraft technology evolved slowly enough that tactics and doctrine could keep pace. By World War II, technology was advancing so rapidly that combat techniques from 1939 were obsolete by 1945. Jets represented the culmination of that acceleration. In just 6 years of war, we went from biplanes still seeing limited service to jets flying at speeds that would have seemed impossible in 1939. That rate of change meant that any technological advantage was temporary, that industrial systems were more important than individual innovations, and that future warfare would be shaped by which nations could rapidly adopt and scale new technologies rather than which nations invented them first. Franz lived another 43 years, dying in 1995 at the age of 79. He witnessed the complete transformation of aviation from the piston engine era to the jet age, watched commercial jet airliners make international travel routine, saw military jets evolve from the crude first generation he'd flown to sophisticated supersonic fighters that would have seemed like science fiction in 1944. In his later years, he occasionally gave lectures to aviation students and historians, always emphasizing the broader lessons rather than the tactical details. His message was consistent, that technological progress is inevitable, but its military application is shaped by industrial capacity, that propaganda and mythology are dangerous guides to understanding reality, and that nations or organizations that believe too thoroughly in their own superiority are setting themselves up for devastating revelation. The jet engine encounters of 1944 and 1945 had taught Franz Weidenbacher that innovation without production is futile, that quality without quantity is insufficient. These were hard lessons, learned at tremendous cost, but they shaped his worldview for the rest of his life. When younger people asked him what he'd learned from the war, he would often return to that July 1944 moment when a British meteor had screamed past his Messerschmitt at an impossible speed, shattering his assumptions in 3 seconds of overwhelming revelation. That moment had contained within it all the lessons he'd needed to learn about technology, warfare, industrial systems, and the dangerous seductiveness of propaganda. It had been the beginning of understanding, purchased at the price of certainty. For Franz and the thousands of German pilots who encountered Allied jets in the final year of the war, the lesson was both humbling and revelatory. That technological sophistication means nothing without the industrial ecosystem to support it. That first-mover advantage can be overcome by rapid adaptation and scaling. And that believing your own propaganda about technological supremacy is a pathway to catastrophic miscalculation. The screaming howl of those jet engines hadn't just announced a new era in aviation technology. It had proclaimed the end of Germany's belief in its technological invincibility, and the beginning of a more sober understanding of how industrial wars are actually won. In the final analysis, the jet engine was less important as a weapon than as a teacher, demonstrating with brutal clarity that innovation is only one component of military effectiveness, and often not the most decisive one. That truth, learned in the skies over a collapsing Reich, would echo through Franz's consciousness for the rest of his days. A reminder that reality always triumphs over mythology, and that the most dangerous assumptions are those you never question until events shatter them beyond repair.